And we know, but in the bunker, he's kind of feels betrayed by everybody, and he's trying to kind of organize the deaths of anyone who's threatening to him. But children, dogs, secretaries. He was a good employer.
Hitler is going to be the main focus of our conversation today. I think. He's somebody who many would describe as perhaps the most evil man in the last century, or perhaps in all of human history. And I think many historians would agree that without him, the extermination of the Jewish people, known as the Holocaust, it would not have happened, and especially on the scale that it did, like with 6 million Jews killed. And without him, I guess there would have been no implementation of the so-called final solution, because that notion of the final solution would not simply have existed. So there would have been anti-Semitism, I think, for sure, because just as there had been for centuries and centuries before Hitler. I'd like to ask you perhaps some more philosophical questions before we get into the man himself. I'd like to. I always begin my conversations by asking people about their origins. What inspired them to pursue what they're pursuing in their lives, and maybe if you could tell us a bit about what led you to study and write about history, and was there some fascination with the subject at school? Maybe what did you study at university? Because I don't not know really that much about your background.
So my background actually isn't really in history. I did study history for what in England we call A levels. So that's when you're aged 16 to 18. But at university, I studied English literature. And the thing, the love that goes right back to when I was a child was for stories and writing. And I really wanted to write. I went to Oxford University, so I studied English there. And then very recently, I've just actually completed a doctorate at Exeter University. But that was in writing, not in history. But the interest in Hitler, why I ended up writing quite a bit about Hitler is sort of, it's partly circumstantial. I was in conversation with a publisher, but I had written a book for children about the English King Henry VIII, and they asked me to look at writing a book for children about Hitler. And so, this is, when is this? This is in about 2005, so a really, really long time ago. And I started researching a book for children about Hitler. And it was very, very clear to me very quickly, this was a terrible idea, or kind of like a project that I wasn't the right person to do, because I don't know if you know about Henry VIII, but he's with the distance of time, he's quite a funny character. He has all these wives, he keeps marrying, he cuts off their head. It's like very extreme, but it's very far in the past. And Hitler, he did such terrible things, but in terms of his life, it's so boring. He's always in meetings. He's always he's talking in beer halls, or he's got meetings with generals. It's kind of like, how do you make this sort of engaging for children? So I was reading a lot about Hitler, and I watched the German film Downfall. I think it's an amazing film, which reconstructs the final days in Hitler's bunker. And really, in a way, both these books have kind of, I would credit that film. And very central to that film is the story of the children of Joseph Goebbels. And here was I reading all these biographies of Hitler, and I hadn't realized that there were children in the bunker. And I went back to these great big thick biographies. I looked, like what? And there would just be like not even a full sentence, like half a line saying Joseph Goebbels arrived with his family. And it's like, but this is 6 children. The oldest is 12. This is a crazy place for children. So really my interest in those final days in the bunker, which I ended up writing about twice, was through the children and the impact of the children. But why I think I got so fascinated by that period and that moment at the end of the Second World War where Nazism collapses is uh, I'm 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 very interested in the kind of traumatic impact of these terrible events. So both my um, parents were alive during the Second World War. And my father would have been a teenager, and my mother was a very young child during the Second World War. And my father lived in the countryside, and I think, for him, it was not such a traumatic experience. But my mother lived in the middle of London, and the children in London were sent out of the city to live with other families, so away from their own family. And that had a big impact on her. So when she was 3, she, went on a train and went to live with strangers. I think they were very nice people. They were very kind. It's not a terrible story, but it's a huge thing for, I don't know, a year or something, not to see your family when you're 3 years old. So I suppose as the next generation, I was aware, my mother would talk about it, and I was aware of ways in which this had affected her. And that is such a tiny, tiny thing, compared to the horrors happening across Europe at that time, and of course since, and more widely in the world. And I just think a kind of completely crucial issue for us as human beings is how we deal with trauma, because undoubtedly, Hitler himself acted out of personal trauma. I'm not saying that's the only issue, but that is, trauma can lead people to act out in violent or damaging ways. That does not always happen, but it really matters um, how we deal with it. And so understanding these terrible events and their impact seems to me just really crucial for us as humans.
So much of what we know about, again, Hitler's last days. I would love if you could maybe talk a bit about that. It comes from his private secretary, Traudl Junge, right?
Yeah,
Or I always have trouble in pronouncing these German names, and I
sure,
hear
me too.
different versions of it. But yeah,
Yeah, me
yeah,
too. Yeah, but I agree with you. I think it's Traudl Junge,
yeah,
I
yeah, yeah,
think.
yeah, yeah. But
But I'm not
I've
German.
heard like over the years
Mhm.
different versions, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah,
It comes from like, especially after the war, she's given quite a few interviews, right? And
yeah,
she wrote even a whole memoir, right? I think it's called "Until the Final Hour," where she
yes.
describes her time working with Hitler. So maybe, yeah, if you could, tell us a bit more about her and why her accounts and like memoir are so important for understanding this whole story. Yeah.
For sure. For sure. So I think Traudl Junge is a really kind of important character for understanding this very issue. and particularly in terms of the importance of kind of acknowledging our own complicity, which was the difficult thing that she had to come to terms with. So she was a very young woman. I think she was about 19 when she first got a job working for Hitler, that it was very competitive to become one of his secretaries. You know, lots of people wanted this work at the heart of government, and she came from Munich. Hitler also had been living in Munich, and he loved her accent. And she got the job when there were probably many others more qualified. So she was very young, and she worked with him during the war, and she ends up, you know, in his bunker at the end of the war. In the Führer bunker, that bit of the underground network where Hitler is living with Eva Braun, who he marries there. There are not many women. It's mostly a world of men. And one of the things that Traudl Junge gets very involved in is actually looking after the children of the Goebbels, because Joseph Goebbels is very occupied with kind of making decisions with Hitler, kind of military decisions or decisions about communicating with the Russians when it gets to that stage and so on. And the children's mother, Magda Goebbels, is psychologically in a very bad state, and she spends most of her time, a lot of her time in bed. So Traudl Junge kind of picks up the pieces and kind of feeds the children and plays with them and does quite a lot of that. After after the she survives. She's one of the people that survives the bunker. She escapes. She manages to escape to the west. And so she's able, you know, after the war to live a quiet, relatively comfortable life. And she spends all her time thinking about how, she was so young. She really can't be held responsible. She didn't know what was going on. She didn't know about the Holocaust. And she's innocent in all this, and that is her mindset for many, many years. And the other kind of thing I find very interesting about her account is that Hitler was very nice to work for. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that people who do the very worst things are not necessarily people who do bad things in every aspect of their life. And he was very comfortable with people who are in a clearly subservient role to him, as, for example, his secretaries were. And he was kindly, and he remembered birthdays, and he reminded them to eat, and he thought about their needs and so on. So she didn't have, she enjoyed working for him, and she felt that she wasn't responsible. But later in life, she came across a memorial to the young woman who had been murdered during the war for her protests against.
Sophie Scholl, if I remember.
Yeah, exactly. Sophie Scholl, the who'd been part of the White Flag protests, and and they were born in the same year. They were exactly the same age. And I sort of feel she could have noted that and just kind of like a lot of people might have noted that and had a moment's discomfort and carried on. But for Traudl Junge, this was the beginning of a big realization that her age was no excuse. Do you know, she should have known, people knew, and that she had been blinding herself to the reality. And at the end of her life, she tried to address that through writing and giving interviews. And I mean that's the right thing to do, isn't it? Is you know is to try not to be defensive. And you know, I think for us in Britain, it's there's a real risk that we, you know, like we have such a strong feeling we were on the right side in probably both world wars. Do you know, we weren't Nazis, and it's very easy for us in Britain to think like we're the good guys, and I think it's very important for us to recognize that we are all human and we are all capable of terrible things, and no country, no government is ever, you know, always the good guys. That doesn't mean to say there aren't, you know, specific things one can do that need doing and are good to do. But I think recognizing complexity is particularly important for British people. And I think that was one of the things that drew me to thinking about Nazism, this kind of great trauma of the 20th century that I felt the repercussions of, to think about that trauma through children, because, you know, who can blame 12-year-old Helga Goebbels? But she is totally swept up by that mentality. You know, we've got pictures of her, you know, doing Hitler salutes and so on. I know, you know, it's of course, most 12-year-olds, you know, believe what their parents tell them and so on. And it was a way in to try and understanding, okay, what is that sort of mindset that people can actually go along with so much murder.
I also find fascinating, and I would like to read this to you. You know, it talks exactly about what I was saying. You know, that later in life, Traudl Junge, she acknowledged that she could perhaps have tried to, you know, find out more about you know, what was really happening in the.
Yeah.
She says
Yeah.
basically, of course, the horrors of which I heard in connection of the Nuremberg trials, the fate of the 6 million Jews, their killing, and those of many others who represented different races shocked me greatly. But at that time, I could not see any connection between these things and my own past. I was only happy that I had not personally been guilty of these things, and that I had not been aware of the scale of these things. However, one day, it's exactly what you were describing. I walked past a memorial to Sophie Scholl, and on the wall, I could see that she had been born the same year as I, and that she had been executed the same year I entered Hitler's service. And at that moment, I realized that it was no excuse that I had been so young. I could perhaps have tried to find out about things. And you know, I love that she's perhaps one of those very few people, I guess, you know, who like those who worked for Hitler, you know, belonged to the Nazi system, who actually acknowledged this, because you know so many others, especially the ones who were actually, you know, committing those terrible crimes and atrocities, you know, they all said when they were being interrogated about their crimes, they all said pretty much the same thing, that you know, I'm not really to blame. It was because of Hitler or Himmler, you know, or whoever you know you can pick, and I just, you know, I was just following orders, and I did what I had to do.
Mm.
For example, there's one case. Maybe you're familiar with this story. This like terrible female perpetrator, Irma Greza, or like again, no, I have trouble with these German names, but like
Yeah.
she was a Nazi concentration guard at Auschwitz and later at Bergen-Belsen, and she was known as the hyena of Auschwitz and the beast of Belsen because of exactly of the like terrible crimes that she committed, and later when she was on trial, she basically said that she denied any like responsibility for those crimes, and had Hitler not existed, someone like Irma Greza, this terrible young woman, she would most likely not have ended up committing all those terrible crimes, and like certainly she would not have been executed by hanging. Nazi Germany would not have existed, and there would have been no Holocaust and so on. So she would probably have been doing her work as a nurse because that's what she wanted to be. She wanted to be a nurse, if I remember the story like correctly.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but there are clear cases where like the Germans themselves they were behaving terribly and like treating people in the most horrible ways imaginable.
That's so interesting and really gets to the heart of it. I mean, I absolutely the execute. I wouldn't execute anybody. I don't think execution is the right way to go. And there's obviously a huge difference between the people that kind of mastermind these events. And you're so right. I mean, all sorts of people will have done terrible things that they would not have done if they hadn't been in that situation. And sometimes that's almost like, I mean, this itself is a kind of controversial term, but a sort of brainwashing that you don't know any different. This is your normal. What are your job opportunities locally? Oh, it's working in a concentration camp. This is what the rules are in the camp. Many of us will go to work in our first job and we're not going to challenge our boss. We're just going to do what we're told. And normally that's fine. But and then at the even more extreme, and this will be I'm sure we're both aware this is happening here and now. There will be people who have minimal choice. Well, they can either die themselves, be killed, or they have to do what they're instructed to do. And who can even say kind of if those of us like myself who are lucky enough never to have been put in that situation, I just feel it's very hard to judge. Who knows what anyone would do. These are really difficult situations. I don't think people should be executed. I think people should be given opportunities to reflect and kind of work out better ways of being. But you really get into the heart of what happens to a nation in these situations.
I also feel pretty much the same way, but still, there are still cases again, like we mentioned this Sophie Scholl, right? People
Yeah.
who resisted. So that makes me, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. There are, and we'd all hope we'd be like her, but like, would we? I'm trying to think what it's called. There's a wonderful book. It might be just called The Holocaust by Martin Gilbert about a historian called Martin Gilbert about the Holocaust, and it's got lots of oral histories from Jewish people who survived. And I now can't remember where this story took place, but I remember it's always stuck with me reading about somebody who was saved by a neighbor that they knew to be anti-Semitic. And they knew that the Nazi troops were kind of coming to their village. They had warning of that, and but very little time, and they just kind of ran to the nearest house. A woman that they knew had a cellar, and there's like a split-second decision as a human being. And she took them in, and she'd been unpleasant to them in the past. She wasn't someone they thought was a great good person or a safe person, but in that they had little choice. She had to make a very sudden decision, and she kept them for until it was safe. I can't now remember how long that was, but she made a snap decision and was prepared to risk her life for theirs. And so I just think it's such a complicated thing what each of us has within us.
Again, I find it fascinating that going back to Hitler, that he was kindly to the people around him, and he loved the Goebbels's children, right? And he loved his dad, obviously. And it's like, it kind of goes against that intuition that many of us might have about him as like, this absolute monster, right? With no like emotion other than hatred. But but he was obviously a human being, and
if anybody was going to threaten his power, he could turn just like that. And we know in the bunker, he's kind of feels betrayed by everybody, and he's trying to kind of organize the deaths of anyone who's threatening to him. But children, dogs, secretaries. He was a good employer. I mean, it's ridiculous, isn't it? But I love the contrast with Churchill. I mean, now in Britain, Churchill more recently has been seen as a more controversial figure. But I would say I grew up in a world where, Churchill was this great hero. And I'm not saying this particular I'm not saying that this particular thing makes makes Churchill a bad person, but he was bad-tempered. He was difficult to work for because he was. I have slightly this quality myself where if I'm reading a book, I forget the world around me. And so there's a little moment where and he'd be kind of like grumpy when he was disturbed, and sort of like to take that moment to move into the other world, and quite so absorbed in his own thoughts, quite kind of would forget that the secretary has now been on duty for so long, surely she needs to go home, or he was in those small ways a much less good employer. And I just think it's important to remember how complicated it all is.
Again, Traudl Junge, his Hitler's private secretary, when she was typing his, I guess it's called last personal and political will, right? And
yes,
testament. And I guess he was saying to her that in the short term we're going to be like seen as this like terrible criminals, who have committed this like atrocities and crimes, but like in the longer term, people will view us as heroes. And it's fascinating to me that until his like very last moments, he like deeply believed in what they had constructed like the Nazi like system, and he deeply believed that what they were doing was right, and that they were trying to create a better future for Germany. And again, like it goes against that maybe intuition that we think of those people as being like this evil absolute monsters, but they themselves felt that they were doing the right thing, that they were good human beings, and to create something good for their country.
I think that's absolutely crucial, because kind of like do you know, like children's sort of superhero films or whatever? The baddie, he is it was usually he, like the so occasionally she, like the devil. Do you know, like this idea of the devil who is planning, oh, what bad things can I do? And people just don't like that. I was really, really struck by the letters that Joseph and Magda Goebbels, just at that same moment when Hitler's doing his last will and testament, just around them, they write letters to Magda's older son, Joseph's stepson, who is at the time a prisoner of war in Britain. And the language that they use is kind of language which anyone would understand. It was slightly old-fashioned now, but it's the kind of language we would all use to justify difficult things we were doing. Do you know, she talks about our splendid concept. She tells him our splendid concept is perishing, and with it goes everything beautiful, admirable, noble, and good that I have ever known in my life. So that's how she sees the National Socialism, that it will bring a world of goodness and beauty, and it's they they thought they were doing good. They thought they were making the world better, that they were protecting the people they saw as the strongest people for the future, the best people for the future, and that would make a better world. And well, yeah, I guess that's what everybody always thinks.
As a Ukrainian, no, I want also to ask you about you may have noticed when we were just chatting on social media, right? When I reached out to you, I have as a profile picture a candle, and it's in memory of my uncle. He was a great man, just passed away just over a month ago, something like this. I'd like to tell you a bit about his story. Basically, he was, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion, right, in February 2022, he went to war almost immediately, and he was, like within the next few days, he was already training, and soon like found himself on the front line, and he took part in some of the most important battles, of this war, like including the ones that led to the liberation of some major cities like Izium, that you may have heard of, or Kherson, and basically, and then while there on the front line, he sustained some very severe injuries, and he basically by some miracle he survived. He could easily have been killed there, but essentially like spent the last 2 years of his life recovering, and he would go a lot of the time to like hospitals and stuff, and but also he would work whenever he could, whenever like the health conditions allowed him to do this, and but then his heart stopped in basically December last year, 2025, and everyone understands in my family and so on that his death was basically the result of all those like terrible injuries that that he got on the front line. So
Okay,
basically, yeah. So he didn't. Fortunately, he didn't die there. On the front line. He fortunately was able to live a few more years, like in a peaceful part of Ukraine. But yeah, I'm just sharing this whole story with you just to point out that there is like hardly a single Ukrainian family now that hasn't been affected on a personal level by this war. It's like, and which is like terrifying to think about, because Ukraine is like the largest country in Europe, and we've got like tens of millions of people living here, and yeah, it's it doesn't always mean that like a personal tragedy like this, but their families haven't heard from their sons, for months or years, and they don't know
Yeah.
if they're like alive or captured or simply
Yeah.
dead. So maybe as a young Ukrainian, I would love to hear your thoughts about what maybe people in your country think about this whole like
For sure.
situation.
For
Yeah,
sure. For
yeah, yeah.
sure. You asked about kind of how people in Britain see the war in Ukraine. I think it's an unusual subject in Britain because it's not controversial at all. I mean, everybody supports Ukraine. It's not divisive. Many Ukrainians came to Britain at the start of the war, and at first, many of them lived in people's homes. It was a sort of project which hasn't happened here before, where it was organized that lots of people, took individuals or small families into their homes. And then now mostly where people have stayed, they're now kind of living independently and have moved on, usually from those first homes. I got because I used to be an English teacher. I didn't mention that earlier, and so I got involved in teaching English to a particular Ukrainian. Um, but she was such an amazing person. Very quickly we became friends, and at first we had like English lessons, and then she knew a little bit of English, but she learned English so quickly, and she created for herself such a busy and successful life that now we're friends, rather than I'm her teacher or anything. And she's called Irina, and she's from Lviv, and she came first of all with her daughter, who was 7 years old at the time, just the two of them. And they were in the house of somebody they knew just through Facebook, but very quickly she got a job. First of all, she in Lviv she had run a business with several shops, but she was prepared to do like any work. She got a job in a factory, and then she was able to afford to pay rent. Her mother joined her, and she works in a factory. And now more recently, her husband has come too, and he has health issues. But my Irina now works in an office. Her English is so good that yeah, she works in an office, and their daughter is doing really well at school. She's top of the class. And yeah, I mean, I love my friend Irina, and she's just inspiring because what would I do if I had to kind of, cross Europe with one of my children and make a life? I don't know how I would manage with that. And I think many of us have been inspired by the Ukrainian people have met.
What's the general mood, in the UK, based on again like your conversations with people and your interactions with them, in regards to like the future of this war and of the like potential outcomes of it, are like the British people feeling optimistic that we would eventually, we as Ukrainians would eventually, achieve peace, and Russia would like finally leave, Ukraine as it should have done years ago, or maybe because there's a lot of talk. There has been a lot of talk lately about the risk of this war expanding to other countries, in Europe. Perhaps we've seen those Russian drones, flying over like Poland and Germany, and yeah. So like Russia is threatening these countries and carrying out this like hybrid war against like NATO. And yeah. So what's like the general feeling about like maybe the outcome of this war?
There's definitely hope, but there's also a very strong feeling with America is feels so uncertain. We're very used to feeling very kind of connected to and dependent on America. I think there's a feeling it's really, really important that Europe strengthens. Recently in Britain, we had the whole question of being in the European Union or not being in the European Union. I don't think it's so much a question of like what's the nature of the relationship between European countries, but we all need to stand up and actually get our defense in a good strong state. And I think there's a feeling in Britain and in the newspapers that we have been too passive, we have been too dependent on America, and that this is widely true in Europe. So I in terms of what do we think the outcome will be, I think that there's a kind of feeling of insecurity with America. There's very strong support for Ukraine, but there's also kind of great fear of this being quite a chaotic world, which is very hard to read, to understand how the big powers will play.
People also like quite seriously talk about like again like potential World War III, maybe, and involving nuclear weapons. So yeah, it's quite terrifying.
Yeah, it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. Do you know, just that feeling that in ways that we don't even really know, our social media, our national debate is getting kind of huge amount of input from Russia. And undoubtedly other places as well.
About again Hitler and how much of do you believe of what he ended up doing, and the fact that he was responsible for the Holocaust and for like the start of World War II? How much of that is like a product of circumstance? Because lots of people say that without like the First World War, he would just have been like this artist. And
I'm sure you're right. Hitler had personal trauma. The Versailles Treaty was, too punitive. But we're constantly in danger of repeating those things again. I mean, it's just there are going to be so many traumatized children. I mean, I think the First World War, it's not just Hitler, it's so many people like Huss, who ran the Auschwitz. His childhood is unbelievable. He has a very, very violent father. He runs away aged 13 and goes and fights in Turkey in the First World War. Do you know, like these are absolutely brutalized people, and that's just a pattern we have to try and break. So I don't know if this is back to front, but Chocolate Cake with Hitler is a fictionalized account of the children of Joseph Goebbels. Oops, I keep getting it wrong. And their time in the bunker. It's historically accurate, but it's told from the point of view of Helga, who was the oldest child, who was 12 years old. And then Rudolf Hitler's Last Day, Minute by Minute, which I wrote with Jonathan Mayo. And that takes the last kind of 36-ish hours of Hitler's life, and it goes through, not literally minute by minute, but kind of what happens next, what happens next. And that's both inside the bunker and also in the rest of the world. So what's happening in Japan or Burma or London or Washington, as well as in Berlin and in the rest of Europe.
Thank you very much for taking the time to talk
Thank
with me.
you
Yeah,
so much for inviting me.
yeah.
And it's been really interesting talking to you. I've really, really enjoyed meeting you.